Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth Nasher Prize Graduate Symposium, dedicated to the work of the 2022 Nasher Prize Laureate, Nairy Baghramian. I'm Catherine Kraft, curator at the Nasher Sculpture Center, and I'll be moderating our virtual events over the next 4 days. Our graduate symposium began in the second year of the Nasher Prize, and in the previous gatherings, we've shared research and insights on the work of Pierre Huyghe, Theaster Gates, Isa Genskin, and Michael Rakowitz. Last year's symposium was the first time we couldn't gather in person due to the global effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. This year, we continue virtually, acknowledging the progress we've made, even as we recognize the losses and strains to our personal, social, and political systems that the pandemic has brought to light and intensified. As we consider our current situation, I'm reminded of Nairy Baghramian's own subtle but pointed criticism of the term social distancing. As she's pointed out, this term emphasizes protecting oneself through isolation. Instead, she has proposed a careful closeness that can respect our social fabric and offer support to others, especially those who don't have the luxury of a retreat into private and peaceful spaces. I met Nairy almost 6 years ago during her visit to Dallas for an initial conversation about an exhibition at the Nasher that will finally, fingers crossed, take place this fall with the creation of new sculptures. Her selection by the Nasher Prize jury as this year's laureate came as a wonderful surprise to us all, and it offers an opportunity for me today, before we get underway, to reflect upon some of the special qualities of her work. Born in 1971 in Iran, Nairy and her family left in 1985, settling in Berlin, where she lives and works today. As she became interested in art, she initially drew more inspiration from the radical forms of theater, dance, and film then flourishing in Berlin than from the neo-expressionist painting popular at that time. As she has explained, at the beginning of her career in the 1990s, she realized that a certain type of art was expected of her. I became aware that post-colonial art or identity politics were expected from me because of my biography as a woman and as a political refugee from Iran. She has described opposing this classification as her first political act, and what this has meant to the development of an art that insists upon social and political significance without recourse to documentary modes of political activism. Instead, as she put it in a 2016 interview, I believe in the political potential of sculptural forms by stressing and exhausting the possibility of the object. Every form carries information about its representational mode, and through its positioning in a contextualized space, also recalls certain ideological presumptions, affiliations, and ideas. The space of sculpture was an element Nairy particularly explored in the early 2000s in works that drew upon her interest in theater and film. And if we could look at the first image, I'm thinking, for example, of Halfway House from 1999, which combined stills from Agnes Varda's film Cléo de Saint-Cassette with photographs from a women's shelter where Nairy had worked and to which, at the beginning of the pandemic, she returned for a period to help her former colleagues. As she's explained, this house was and is a protective space for women fleeing difficult domestic situations. But it was meant as a temporary stop, a site of respite, but also transition. Her staged photographs show a phone booth installed in the house's space to provide a link to the world outside, between private refuge within and the need to communicate with the public world without. Likewise, the ways that architecture and public spaces construct our experiences with art and with one another have been a leitmotif of her work. In Spanner, could I have the second slide? Unfortunately, I'm having a technical problem. I'm supposed to be able to advance it, but I'm not able to. We're going to be looking into some of the technical problems in the screen sharing. But to return to what I was speaking of, the ways that architecture and public spaces construct our experiences with art and with one another have been a leitmotif in Nairy's work. What you'll hopefully see in a moment in Spanner, you'll see two tautly stretched tensioning devices. And there it is. These two devices cordon off part of a museum gallery, left disconnected to lie limply on the ground. Its counterpart, Peeper, in the next slide, calls into question the possibility of enforcing boundaries. Public spaces likewise establish expectations. For her contribution to Sculpture Park Münster in 2007, Nairy selected a parking lot for her site in the next image and presented on tracks, a segmented vinyl screen with mirror, which was eventually tagged with graffiti. Nothing about it advertised, so it should be treated as more than a barrier or a temporary inconvenience. 10 years later, she returned to Münster, as you'll see in the next image, this time selecting the courtyards of the Erbdrostenhof for the installation of the aptly titled Privileged Points. Nairy's regular occupations with seemingly marginal transitional areas call attention to the ways we understand artworks, as well as ourselves in particular spaces. And next slide, please. As Phillida Barlow, who shared an exhibition with Nairy in 2010 at the Serpentine Gallery, has observed, an encounter with Nairy Baghramian sculpture is to discover how the work's occupation of space challenges the space you, the viewer, occupy. There is a bodily, visceral clash between the viewer and the viewed, asking the question as to which has which role, sculpture as viewer and viewer as viewed, or vice versa. The world confronts us with polarities, sculpture and viewer, inside and outside, male and female, public and private. Nairy's work takes these binaries seriously, all the better to explore and test them, to find their weaknesses and contradictions, to question their persistence, to undermine them, and seek alternative ways to create and live in the world. We could also look to Nairy's engagement with design and its relationship to architecture, especially through her friendship and collaboration with the designer Jeannette Lavrière in the next image. Their dialogue goes beyond the simple act of celebrating a neglected figure to consider how design became both a refuge and confinement for women as well as gay men who were not able to participate in the male-dominated, supposedly more serious discipline of architecture. Nairy has recognized both the restrictions in this division of spheres and its opportunities, noting the possibilities of what one can do behind closed doors. An experience I had myself as a child in Iran, where dance, theater, music, and the presence of the body were banned from the public sphere. Now, it may seem that I've barely touched upon the sculptural objects proper that comprise the crux of Nairy's work, but I think it's important to emphasize how she has acted upon and created spaces and contexts for such objects to exist. Her sculptural practice entails the use of conventional materials such as marble, wood, and bronze, as well as aluminum, silicon, and resin. And if we can see the next slide, you'll see that she gives physical form to her concern through sculptures that both use and visually refer to traditional processes of making sculpture, as in the Maintainers, multi-part sculptures that include wax, traditionally used as a protective substance among its component and mutually supporting elements. And in Dwindlers, in the next slide, we may consider that if her sculptural forms seem to reference parts of the body, their deployment in relation to architectural settings proposes analogs and parallels with seemingly prosthetic elements negotiating between the two categories of structure. The interior of a building echoes the interior of a body. And in the next slide, this echoing between interior of building and interior of body also implies that both may be subject to some kind of support, correction, or supplementation. This brings me finally to a quality of Nairy's practice that I find especially striking in our present moment. Its openness to impermanence, discontinuity, even failure. As she's memorably put it, sculpture should have the chance to not fulfill expectations. Drawings and maquettes from Side Leaps in the next slide present concepts of sculptures that will never be executed. And you see the drawings and maquettes in the vitrines in this image. For her 2016-2017 survey, Deformation Professionnelle, she responded to earlier works by creating counterparts and rejoinders. With the exception, perhaps, of privileged points, many of these ran counter to modernist traditions of enlargement or aggrandizement. Instead, the more recent contributions often seemed to cast their predecessors in a more vulnerable light, as with the contrast we saw earlier in my presentation between Spanner and Pieper. And similarly, in the next slide, the toothy elements of scruff of the neck were extracted, leaving just in the next slide, the spare and empty aluminum structures in the more recent work. In the next slide, class reunion was joined by the ones left behind. In the next, the stay downers, including the nerd, the malingerer, the truant. Continuing in this vein, most recently, misfits, in the next slide, have considered objects and individuals who fail to conform to societal and artistic expectations. In another recent sculpture, seen in the next slide, knee and elbow position massive marble blocks joined with stainless steel fittings next to each other, offering a meditation on the distribution of weight and the burden that joints carry when a body poses, a question that can be extended, as the artist puts it, to who is taking the burden, who is doing the work. And if we could stop sharing the screen now, I'd like to point out that these questions resonate beyond Nairy's sculpture, of course, not only in the context of the pandemic and who among us is taking the burden, but also more lightly, perhaps, in our proceedings this week. I'm delighted to be here and to welcome the students who will join me in doing the work, presenting their research on different aspects of Nairy Baghramian's sculpture. Over the next 3 days, we will hear from 5 presenters, 1 today and 2 each tomorrow and Thursday, followed by a roundtable discussion among all of us on Friday, before our keynote address from Professor Miwon Kwon to end the symposium. I'd like to invite your participation in the form of questions submitted through the chat. We'll be answering them at the end of each day's presentations. I'll bring these remarks to a close by introducing our first and only speaker today. Inji Kim is a PhD student in art history at the University of Washington. The title of her paper is Nairy Baghramian, Stretching Beyond the Material. Inji, welcome and take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Catherine, for the great introduction. And I'm very honored to speak at this symposium. And as Catherine told you already, the title of my paper is called Nairy Baghramian, Stretching Beyond the Material. And My first encounter with Big Valve by Nairy Baghramian was through an image file on a 13-inch laptop screen, while it was on its way to be installed for the poet engineers at Miguel Abreu Gallery in New York. And coincidentally, two other past laureates of the prize were actually in this exhibition. Both Isa Gensken and Pierre Heed's work were also present in the exhibition. And even in photographic documentation, Big Valve bears a sense of precariousness that emerges from its balance of strikingly different materials, masses, and textures. The slanted positioning of the work also evokes a feeling of neither here nor there. A bolted metal arm conjoins two components, a slim black oblique pole made with polyurethane and a clear glossy polycarbonate panel that outlines a heart. Balancing dual themes is also palpable in the interplay between materials and iconography. The work simultaneously evokes a mechanical sensation through its material composition, while constructing corporeality through depicting a heart, an organ composed of muscle, blood, and tissues. The topic of my talk emerged out of my recent interest in how working with photographs impacts our understanding of artwork, especially in scholarly context. What I am presenting is a preliminary reflection of a few questions I've been engaging with. What are the limitations of artwork when we're viewing and interpreting them based on photographs? And on the flip side, what elements of artwork are emphasized when we look at them through their documentation? Nairy sculptures that actively engage with the notion of space and artwork's agency provide a fertile ground in which to ask these questions. Can a work of art act as an autonomous subject when it's outside of its original context? And is it able to bear meaning beyond the context it was created and shown? The question of how the artwork's agency interrogates its contextual conditions is an interesting question that I've been overly grappling with. And looking at photographs of Baghramian work is, I'll argue, key to revealing conceptual stakes that are central to her approach to making sculpture. After the show at Miguel Abreu was over, I began to ruminate on this work and Baghramian's practice at large and realized the dual function of the wall as a constant and a variable. Beyond this tripartite fabrication, Big Valve also utilizes the wall as a fourth element that augments the architectural sense evoked by its construction materials. As a constant, no matter where the work is installed, the wall completes the work's need to balance itself in between corners of an interior space, often in a museum or a gallery. As a variable, the wall signifies a specific location, a new context for the work to be occupying space, and inevitably demands an understanding of its surroundings. The active dichotomies that dictate this work are emblematic of Nairy's continued engagement with contemporary issues that are innate in sculptural practice and artistic production. In photographs of these sculpture, the wall becomes less of a variable since the photograph grants specific focus on the artwork and gives it a continued existence through documentation. Using photographs of the Big Valve as an entry point to understand Baghramian's oeuvre emphasizes how its agency prevails over time, space, and context. The boundaries between these elements collapse in photographic documentations. The site becomes objectified, and the art object is subjected to continued interpretations. Prior to discussing how photography mediates our understanding of sculptural agency, I want to give an overview of how Baghramian's works stand in relation to historical developments in sculpture that germinated in the 1960s. Historically, for the majority of its existence, sculpture operated in representative terms, often to depict figures in power in monumental places. In Sculpture in the Expanded Field, Rosalind Krauss discusses modernist sculpture's departure from its strict ties with the notion of monumentality, and how loss of sight as an index for sculpture becomes a crucial component to sculptural production. The meaning and sculpture of function of sculpture became essentially nomadic, and that through the representation of its own materials or the processes of its construction, the sculpture depicts its own autonomy. Krauss repeatedly states how the active rejection of tradition was a worthwhile investigation for a few decades. However, the negation of a fixed tradition eventually hits a threshold. Countering this sense of inertia, the definition of sculpture began to stretch beyond immediate and material conditions to a realm in which it operates in relation to the logical operations on a set of cultural terms, which is emblematic to any artistic production in the postmodern condition. The forte of Baghramian's practice emerges in her ability to engage with the nuances that exist within the strata of cultural terms that she examines. Specifically, the artist's astute understanding of and engaging with art historical issues are consistent undercurrents throughout her practice, which compel dynamic interpretations of her work. Andre Rotman, who contributed an essay on Baghramian's practice for the exhibition catalog for Déformation Professionnelle, her survey that took place in SMAC, which is the Municipal Museum of Contemporary Art in Ghent, Belgium, and Walker Art Center in Minneapolis in 2017, nods at Krauss's discussion by noting that most positions in the field of contemporary sculpture by now not merely expanded, but positively exploded. The transfusion of contemporary daily experiences and objects with formal considerations of sculpture that define Baghramian's work in this regard is notably and intentionally non-prescriptive and ambivalent. In a recent interview, Baghramian elaborated on her conscious embrace of ambivalence in response to the exclusionary nature of history. Begin quote, "One of the earlier reasons behind this ambivalence was triggered not at a university, but in school. I was at a German school. Periodically, a Holocaust survivor would visit to discuss the unimaginable and inhuman terror of the Nazis. But in all these years, I never witnessed a German Nazi or the relative of someone who was collaborative with the Nazi regime come in to discuss their history with us. That part of the history, the confrontation with the perpetrator, was missing. That unbalanced experience brought me to the troubled and complex thing that is abstraction. And for me, ambivalent abstraction is a collection of problems." End quote. As we can see, dissecting ostensible singularities in contemporary experience is Baghramian's primary concern, and she dictates abstraction in order to address issues with dominant narratives and definitions. This attitude is further evident in how she chose to organize her retrospective. Rather than adhering to the conventional way of presenting bodies of works that traverse an artist's career, Déformation Professionnelle presented works that altered or responded to her past work. The organization of the exhibition shows the artist's belief that artistic convictions that crystallize over time do not emerge in a linear progress. Rotman writes that the artist updates the examination, increasingly probing since post-minimalism, of the factors which determines the increasingly segmented process of the production and contextual situation of the art object, increasingly subject to semiologic definition rather than stringent self-reflection. Visually, this is manifested in the synchronization of various objects and experiences through the combination of contrarian registers. Baghramian's work often contemplate and reference banal subjects and present them in unfamiliar ways. Conceptually, this interpretation by Rotman highlights the continuous presence of time as an element that dictates her work. The repetitive use of words such as updates, increasingly, and post-minimalism in Rotman's text show that Baghramian engages with time as a structure. As we can see, Baghramian already considers the possibilities of afterlife and afterthoughts of her work extensively. Thus, photographic documentations of her psych-responsive works can be used to emphasize how she creates art that exists within its own context. This approach is particularly instrumental to understanding how Baghramian uses her practice to investigate the semiotics of space as a component of sculptural practice and how conceptual elements of her work corroborate the multiplicities that she investigates through controlling material conditions. Photography's impact on documenting and understanding sculpture has been investigated by art historians due to tensions between the two mediums. In Photography and Sculpture, Art, Object, and Reproduction, Sarah Hamill and Megan Luke talk about how photography's ability to compress space into two dimensions counters the spatial nature of sculpture. They explain, in a photograph, a sculpture's materiality and scale are made portable and flexible, all the better to classify, compare, and study the object from afar. Sculpture is thereby transformed into an imaginative picture, an animated vision of its form, surface, or site. As discussed before, Baghramian has been keenly aware of the fact that the objects that she has created have the potential to be classified, compared, and studied. In fact, through the format of Deformation Professionnelle, the artist actively participates in this exchange herself. While I had the opportunity to encounter Baghramian's work in person, and that experience most certainly has shaped my perception of it, the primary ways in which I have been engaging with her work are still predominantly dictated by the photographs I saw online and in print. While the sculpture is no longer physically present in the exhibition space, the context of the work is still frozen in photographs, strongly tied to the sites that they once occupied, which strengthens the specific messages that Baghramian aimed to convey about the sites that she was responding to. Other than Big Valve, Baghramian produced an expansive range of works that are site-responsive or site-specific. For example, Scruff of the Neck is a series of work that was installed in various locations. Similar to Big Valve, these sculptures have an overt connection to the human body in their title and their reference points. In fact, reading the two works together reveals how Baghramian has a penchant to depict body parts that are essential to human life, such as the heart and the neck. While they strategically shy away from straightforward depictions of these parts, these sculptures, through their emphasis on structure and dependence on architecture, emphasize the build of the human body. Baghramian talks about how she views these body parts as something invisible that is needed to keep things going, holding the space, not making a fuss, continuing. This construction acts as a reminder that while the body is often related to the idea of subjectivity, it is inextricably tied to both physical and conceptual structural apparatuses. In 2016, Scruff of the Neck was presented as an exhibition at Marion Goodman Gallery in London, which was designated so that the visitors would have to enter the gallery from its back. This strategy shows how Baghramian is keenly aware of the conceptual dimensions of her practice that extends beyond their physical sculpture. Even prior to entering the space and seeing the work, the viewer was already oriented to think about the implications of the hierarchies of space. Through dictating the way in which the works must be viewed, the artist reminds the viewer that their bodies and thought processes are inevitably controlled by various decisions made by other people. An interesting tension arises between the artist's decision and the images from the exhibition, as the unconventional procession of the work is still missing. All we can see from photographs are sculptures occupying the gallery space. Beyond its reference to the neck, the series connects with teeth, most specifically dentistry. This elongated and shiny, polished metal skeleton of the work evokes mouth mirrors, scalers, and drills that we commonly see during our visits to the dentist. The element is more evident in the iteration of the work that was installed in the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis between 2017 and 2018. The most notable difference between the two versions of the work is the absence of teeth-like components made with plaster and beeswax. Photographs of each sculpture capture this shift and show the artist's thought process, which grant them meaning beyond their relationship with other works in respective exhibitions. In this revisited version, Baghramian further emphasizes the sculpture's dependence on the gallery wall, and this could be interpreted in conjunction with her continued interest in institutional critique. In her own words, the artist considers the description of museum spaces and their organization for the purpose of the presentation of art reveals that this process offers numerous opportunities for inversive design, but also for manipulation. The category of the display in particular comes into view as a scene on which complex relations between beholder and objects are enacted, allowing for perceptions such as opacity versus transparency, or historicizing versus modernizing readings. For her 2016 installation, Es ist außer Haus, which translates to It is outside of the house in Kunsthal Basel, the Baghramian photographed the interior of a state museum that was once a residential palace for monarchs in Tehran. Amidst a lavish and stately interior design, the museum chose to display photographs of statements from its collections, such as Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, Mao Zedong, and Adolf Hitler, but did not allow the viewers to take photographs of the interior and these portraits. Baghramian broke this rule and secretly took photographs of what she saw, blew it up to a large scale, and decided to place it as a part of an installation that was shown in a different museum. This active subversion through the act of photographing and displaying shows how the artist engages with the tension that exists between documentation and materialization, while pondering the power structures that constitute the viewer's agency and behavior in monumental places. So to conclude, photographs of Baghramian sculptures with documentary functions intersect with many conceptual parameters that are very much evident in her practice. Reading these photographs as aesthetically charged mediums extends the agency of the artwork by complicating its relationship with site and context. Especially in shifting institutional contexts, Baghramian sculptures that respond to museum and gallery sites show that they exist beyond their material construction, granting them a subjectivity that allows them to occupy continued presence and interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you, Inji, for that really interesting presentation. We do have some time for questions, and I want to encourage those of you watching to please put them into the chat. They will be relayed to me, so there may be a little bit of a lag. Inji, I already have something that came up just as a kind of request for more information about your experience when you were at the gallery and were able to actually be present with the work itself after having seen it in photography. What was that experience like for you? I mean, were there things about the sculpture itself that were surprising or that you didn't expect from the photo?
Yeah, absolutely. I think theoretically and kind of in my mind's picture, I presumed that the work was going to be quite shiny, that it was going to have a very shiny surface, but seeing it in person, kind of the transparency of especially the clear segment was quite surprising. And it was kind of contrasted with how matte the black and oblique pole that like it supports itself was at. So that was quite surprising. And the sheer, and I think Scruff of the Neck was also in this show. And I think for that one, I was just quite surprised by how it really is able to balance seemingly different scales. And I was just kind of really excited about the dominance that it had over a wall that it was installed. Whereas Big Valve was definitely, I thought it was going to be a lot more present and assertive, but because of its kind of in-between nature, it was a lot more seamlessly installed in the gallery space, which was very interesting.
I think that your mentioning of scale and the experience of scale is, of course, something that is very difficult to discern from photography. And I think it's an important, one of the distinctions that you can make. And I just wonder if Do you see, do you have a sense of what, how Nairy Baghramian approaches the question of scale in her sculptural works?
Yeah, I think, well, in terms of relaying or seeing works on photography, I think the primary questions that arise obviously have to do with scale. And also for kind of more traditional sculptures, also relaying the sense of kind of corporeality in a sense as well. But I think in terms of Baghramian's work, scale obviously has a lot. Well, for me, especially writing about these works is also an active engagement with the architecture of space. So when I was thinking about Scruff of the Neck, that was installed in quite a smaller gallery space, it really had this almost like a main character presence. Whereas when I presumed that this was when it was shown in, you know, London or even at the Walker, I'm sure this was, it just kind of felt like a small component of this big museum space. So I think for Baghramian, scale is almost like this very, especially in our like site responsive works, very mindful of where the work is going to be installed and ultimately the kind of scale of the exhibition space it's being shown in, if that makes sense. So I think it has this very responsive feature.
Mm-hmm. And I'm taking just a moment to have a look. So, another question coming up might be in speaking about photography and its relation to Baghramian sculpture. As you mentioned with the work with the surreptitiously taken photo at the House Museum, photography does play a part in Baghramian's work, not just in, you know, this kind of documentation of installation photographs, but there is a conceptual role to be played. It seems to me in many of her works, and they're not directly among the sculptures that you were talking about in your presentation, but I wonder if you have any thoughts about the role of photography in Baghramian's installations or in her sculptural practice.
Yeah, I kind of restricted, I was really tempted to speak more about her photography and how she kind of uses them to engage further with usually the exhibitions that she presents. So I think for the Formation Professionnelle, she had this kind of series of photographs that had like smoke coming out of this kind of like building, and it was in reference to kind of artistic process and how an artist like thought process ultimately shapes artistic production. But so I was really tempted to talk about that, but I felt like that really I had to keep thinking about how I have to still stick to sculpture as a kind of major component of this talk. And that's why I was quite excited to come across this 2006 installation, because I felt like it showed how she's very aware of photography's power and its certain function to present facts, but also kind of in a very controlled way, in a way that she still responded to the power of institutions, which is obviously a very consistent theme in her work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And let's see, I have one more question that has come up, which is just a very practical question in a way about the installation of Big Valve, which you described, and we saw in the photo being against the wall. But does it actually require a kind of doorway, or because it looks in the photograph as if part of it is leaning against the wall, and then the sort of dark, that sort of bar is leaning against the opening, the opening of what appears to be a doorway.
So she made various iterations of this work, obviously in between kind of, I think, its original conception and what she ended up showing in different places. But so the work that I showed in this iteration obviously requires this doorway and has this in-between function, but I've also seen works that are standalones. But for me, like the ones that kind of actively engage with the idea of in-betweenness are a lot more interesting.
Let's see, I'm just checking. I have one more question here. We have a question from Lee Arnold, our associate curator. She's interested in how photography, especially photography directed by the artist, is a way to control the viewer's perception of the work, and how much you think Baghramian plays with that control or aspect of photography.
So I think I thought about this a lot, just kind of, okay, like, I mean, when I was writing about this, I was like, is this like too far-fetched? Like, is this like a very removed argument from like the artist's original intention? Because obviously, I don't know actually if she's in charge of constructing the images that we see, and if she's also in charge of, you know, selecting which images we ultimately see. And from my experience at Miguel Lebrun, I know that she wasn't really involved in this process. Like, it was very much in-house, like people in the gallery installed it, and they were thinking about their terms, about how, you know, how is it going to best appear like for a buyer, for example, or a client, or how is it going to best represent the gallery space, and how is it best going to represent, like, so I think like different motivations ultimately made this photograph that I presented on, which made me, but also like I thought like even that process was very much, very kind of intertwined with how Baghramian thinks about artwork in general, because she's so interested in kind of various agents that come into play when sculpture is understood, especially her work. So in that aspect, I thought, okay, like even after these various iterations and the final images that we see versus the actual work and how the artist came to like make and conceive the work, like what are some of the elements of the artwork that still translate and transcend all of these various contexts? And as a scholar who is always interacting with artwork through documentation, mainly documentation, especially during COVID, you know, what can I take away? So I thought the conceptual dimensions of her work were still very, very much present despite these iterations, which made me think about kind of the fluency of each work in a sense that Baghramian was able to conceive. I don't know if that's a good answer.
Yeah, I think that's very good. And in fact, we have a second question very much related to that, and you may have already answered it, but let's see if you have any further thoughts. It's from Kim Rhodes. Inji, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that you first encountered Big Valve on a 13-inch computer screen. Do you have any thoughts about the way in which we encounter photographs of Baghramian's work on a screen, in a book, as a physical standalone photograph?
So what I'm understanding is like, can they be viewed as like almost like a photography work? Is that what the question is saying?
I think so. I mean, I think the question is whether the mode in which, or the format in which we encounter photographs of the work has an impact on
Right. Yeah.
some of the ways, like a digital image versus publication in a book. Or
right. So that's actually, yeah, that's a great question. So obviously, like my first encounter with the work on a laptop screen was also very much impacted by my then position as an intern. So I was more concerned about, like, oh my goodness, like how am I going to best preserve the resolution of this like image online versus how is it going to be printed, and how am I going, what image format is best and which color scheme is best for me when we're, printing it in a small box for a checklist versus if it's going to go on line. And so in that aspect, kind of even like the size of the image and its like various formats was actually a very big concern for me when I was working on this. And it also allowed me to really, really zoom in because we got these really high-res photographs. So before the work even came into the space, I zoomed into kind of the bolts. I can show you again if they let me share my screen again, but these kind of metal bolts, I was able to kind of really, really zoom in and see like, oh, like, is this more decorative or does it have like a very specific function? And I was just trying to understand how the work was going to be installed in a very physical sense. And when I saw the work again in publication, I actually had this interesting moment, especially with Scruff of the Neck, but the catalog for Deformation Professionnelle had the installation images from like this. It was like the same work, and one of them was at Marion Goodman, and one of them was at the Walker. So I could really like very clearly see her choice to omit the like beeswax element in a very clear manner, and obviously that is not the case for a real viewing experience because the likelihood of an audience member seeing both the show at London and the Walker is almost impossible, and for them to make that connection. But the publication very clearly kind of juxtaposed those two images to show the shift of mind that she had and this very strategic choice. So in that case, like these two works that were existing in the context of their respective exhibitions are really, really focused on this like transition that are kind of more intimate to that series alone. And I think in that case, that format on the publication and that juxtaposition really, really created a much richer context for us to understand Baghramian's intention.
Mm-hmm. I think that makes a lot of sense. And one thing I thought of as you were speaking in terms of being able to zoom with high resolution virtual images, especially as works may migrate from a gallery to a museum, you can also have a kind of visual access to details of the work or angles of the work that you're really not permitted to have in a museum because of security considerations. This kind of disembodied gaze is it's a very different kind of way of interacting with a work of art.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the key texts that I looked at when I was writing this paper, which was photographing sculpture, it was really kind of tracing through more like historical sculptures, and a lot of the questions that they had were translating three-dimensionality in a two-dimensional space and how that was virtually like impossible, or like there were different methods to do this. And then I was thinking about what this means in relation to contemporary sculptural practice, and how if similar issues still persists or new kind of fields emerge when we think about in terms of just translating the original context or the original work. And then I started really thinking about the conceptual dimensions of Baghramian's work and how that really plays into our photographic encounters.
Wonderful. And I'm confident, given especially how many of us are engaging with ideas and objects and images of objects right now, and the role that virtual media is playing. These will be topics we return to over the course of the next few days. Inji, I want to thank you for your paper and for kicking off our symposium. And I will just let everyone know that brings us to the end of day one for the Nasher Prize Graduate Symposium. I hope you can return tomorrow at the same time, under the same Vimeo link, I believe, for our next two presentations. Thank you all for joining us, and goodbye.
Thank you.